Welcome you all to the sixth installment of the Mary Hepburn Lecture. My name is Todd Dinkelman. I'm a member of the Social Studies Education faculty in the Department of Ed Theory and Practice here in the College of Education. Just a note on the procedure for tonight. We're scheduled to end at 7:30, and I believe Wayne plans to make about 50-50 use of the time left over after this introduction, 50% on the lecture and 50% on questions and dialogue and discussion. So you can plan accordingly. I'd like to start my introduction by thanking Dr. Hepburn for her generosity and for her continued support of social studies education at the University of Georgia, in the state of Georgia and beyond. This is the fourth time I've had the pleasure of thanking Mary Hepburn, and I predict that when I see her later this evening, this will be the fourth time that she tells me, "Oh, please dispense with those kind words, and people are here to hear the lecturer." So in advance of that conversation that we will have, Mary, for the fourth time, I hear you, and yet I find it impossible to acknowledge your work, yourself, your support of this annual event without at least saying something nice. So here it goes. I will not go into detail about your considerable accomplishments and legacy. I'll simply note for the record that you are Professor Emerita of Social Studies Education at UGA, where you served the field for 30 years. As a leader in the field of civic education, you left an impressive imprint on social studies, an imprint not felt only in Georgia, but also in the United States and internationally as well. And that impression continues in no small part because you, when you retired, you chose to give back to social studies education. Your endowment of this lecture helps advance the University of Georgia as one of the more prominent places on the map of social studies research, teacher education, and graduate studies. We are deeply appreciative. And so with those few words, I'd like to thank, acknowledge, welcome, and introduce you and your husband, Dr. Larry Hepburn. This is Mary Hepburn, everybody. Thank you. That's it. Fifth time I might call off the ponies. All right. Now to our lecture for tonight. Wayne Ross is a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy, and he's co-director of the Institute for Critical Education Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Professor Ross received his PhD from the Ohio State University, where he wrote his dissertation on the professional socialization of secondary social studies teachers. Before that, he received both a bachelor's and an MAT degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He began his career in education, at least the paid part of his career in education, as a day worker in North Carolina, and then as a secondary social studies teacher just down the road in Atlanta. Professor Ross has published more than 20 books and over 200 articles, book chapters, essays, and reviews on curriculum studies, social studies education, teacher education, and critical pedagogy. Let me repeat that. He has published more than 20 books and over 200 articles. That's impressive. Recent book titles include The Social Studies Curriculum, Purposes, Problems, and Possibilities, now in 4th edition. Another book titled Critical Theories, Radical Pedagogies, and Social Education. Another Education Under the Security State. Another Battleground Schools. The Nature and Limits of Standards-Based Education Reform. And finally, Neoliberalism and Education Reform. 4 of his books have received the American Educational Studies Critics' Choice Award, so they've been very well received. Dr. Ross's teaching, writing, and advocacy are about the politics of curriculum, critical pedagogy, social studies education, and academic labor. In recent years, Dr. Ross's principal research interests have been the influence on curriculum and teaching of the educational standards and high-stakes testing movement, an issue that's on all of our minds. Looking at the surveillance-based and spectacular conditions of postmodern schools and society, his aim has been to develop a radical critique of schooling as social control and a collection of strategies that can be used to disrupt and resist the conformative, anti-democratic, anti-collective, and oppressive potentialities of schools, practices he calls dangerous citizenship. Ross is co-founder of the Rouge Forum, a group of educators, parents, students, and community activists seeking more democratic education. He currently serves as editor of no less than 3 journals, Critical Education being one of them, Workplace, a journal for academic labor, another, and Cultural Logic. Oh yes, and he's also served 2 terms as editor of the leading social studies education research journal, Theory and Research in Social Education. Did you get all that? And mind you, this is Dr. Ross's brief bio. What he would not include on his intellectual biography, but what should be included in my introduction tonight, are the less visible roles that he has served in this profession. Wayne has mentored countless graduate students and early career social studies faculty. If you look him up on Rate My Professor, which I did, you see little else than glowing reports from those students who have been fortunate enough to call him their teacher. By my estimation, his greatest contribution to the field has been as a tireless advocate for democratic education, a critical democratic education, a kind of social studies teaching and learning that has unfortunately been more idealized, theorized, and talked about than actually practiced in the nation's classrooms. And this has never been more the case than in the current climate of capitalist-driven education reform. My own view, and the view of many of the people sitting in this room, is that the field needs as many voices like Wayne's as we can find. And we need these voices now more than probably any other time in the last century. I am delighted his voice will fill this lecture hall tonight, and that he was willing to cross the continent to share his time with us. We're very fortunate to have him here. Please welcome Professor E. Wayne Ross.
Do I need to put this on, you think? Yeah, I'll put it on anyway. I might not need it. Thank you. First of all, thanks to Mary for endowing this lectureship. If I can get my microphone on, I'll look at you. It's an honor to give the Mary Hepburn Lecture. Her legacy to social studies, as Todd was just talking about, is so impressive, and to also be in the group of folks that have followed me, that I follow in, the previous presenters who are all good colleagues of mine, and I'm just proud to and humbled to be in the same group. And Todd, thanks for the great introduction. I did start, I'm going to change the lighting, I think, here. And I'm a Mac person, but this machine here is Windows, so excuse me if I'm, okay. Now I can't see my notes because it's so dark. I wanted to start by talking about, I was a daycare teacher for 5 years, and then I worked as a social studies teacher in North Carolina. And way back when, and I was interested in getting out of North Carolina and coming to the big city in Atlanta, and I wrote job application letters to every school district in Atlanta Metro, and I went and looked up an old, the internet would have been great if it had come around sooner. There was this directory called Peterson's Directory that had like the addresses of every school in the United States, and I wrote letters to every principal in Fulton County, DeKalb County, Cobb County. And out of all of this kind of, and this was on a typewriter too, by the way. And finally, I got a call from Fulton County Schools. This was in 1979. And on the other end of the line was a wonderful woman and a person who's contributed so much to social studies in Georgia, and her name was Helen Richardson. And she invited me she said, we've looked over your application, and we've set up interviews for you to come down to 5 high schools. And those high schools were, most of them were in northern Fulton County: Crestwood, Roswell, Milton, and North Springs High School in the north part of the county, and Palmetto High School, which I understand is not around anymore. It's been merged, but down in Fairburn. Anybody go to any of those schools? Okay. I'll tell you what happened briefly. The North Springs High School, which is where I taught, was the last school on the list. In the first 3 schools, the first question that the principal asked me was, can you coach football? And at the time, I never played football. I ran cross country and track, and I did that in college a little bit. And I said, no, I cannot coach football. And post haste, the interview was over. And then when I went down to Palmetto, I got a little different question, and that was, can you coach wrestling? And it was like, no, I can't coach wrestling. So I just knew I was striking out at every one of these. And so last day, I'm at North Springs up in Sandy Springs, and principal calls me in, go back to his office, and the first thing he says is, can you coach soccer? And I paused for a minute, and I didn't say anything. And then he kind of rephrased the question. He says, well, have you ever played soccer? And I said, yeah, I have. And he said, well, when did you play soccer? And I said, well, I played soccer when I was a college student. And he said, great. He says, we need a soccer coach, and you've got the job. Well, I had played soccer when I was a college student, but intramural soccer. And it was on a really bad dorm team, and we lost immediately. But anyway, I did get the job, and just to prove to you, this is from the Journal-Constitution, 1981, and that's me there in the middle, and I'm coaching my team. We beat Riverwood that game. I'm kind of a nostalgia person, so when I was coming back down here, I said, I want to reminisce about my old coaching days a little bit. So please pardon my nostalgia here. But I showed up. I had never really played soccer, and the first day of school, I was in my room preparing my room, and all these guys started coming by and sticking their heads in, and they said, are you Coach Ross? And I said, well, you know, I'm Mr. Ross. And they said, oh, so we play on the soccer team. And as it turns out, at the time, I don't know how they've done since, but North Springs High School had won 7 Georgia State titles in soccer. So you talk about the pressure being on, is probably even more pressure than I'm facing tonight delivering this lecture. But I did survive that. So I just wanted to start there. I also want to say that I've got a long, but I think image-rich PowerPoint, and if you want to take a look at it, you can go to ewaynross.net and you can download the PDF version, or if you're on your computers now. But tonight I want to talk about insurgent pedagogies and the pursuit of dangerous citizenship. And I'll get to my conclusion here very quickly. But I want to start with a quote from Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. And as you read through this, he says, by means of ever more effective methods of mind manipulation, democracies will change their nature. The quaint old forms of elections, parliaments, Supreme Courts, and all the rest will remain. The underlying substance will be a new kind of totalitarianism. All the traditional names, all the hallowed slogans will remain exactly what they were in the good old days. Democracy and freedom will be the theme of every broadcast and editorial. Meanwhile, the ruling oligarchy and its highly trained elite soldiers, policemen, and thought manufacturers and mind manipulators will quietly run the show as they see fit. I think what Huxley was describing was really what is in effect today. In fact, I'm going to start by talking about what I see as a crisis in democracy. And democracy today, as a concept, as a thing, has less to do with the actual content of what we think about when we use the term democracy, that is an egalitarian political and economic system, than it does with the neglect of that content, and the promotion of the form. Simply put, the concept of democracy in the West is the mere distillate remaining after the actual content, that is equality, egalitarianism, justice, and rights, has been boiled away. In societies dominated by, this is Guy Debord, who's a philosopher who's had a big impact on my thinking. In 1967, he wrote this: "In societies dominated by modern conditions of production, life is presented as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has receded into representation." And what Debord talks about is, he's not talking about democracy per se, but he's talking about just the living of life. And he talks about the degradation of life in capitalist societies, writing in 1967, from living and being, to a state of having, to a state of appearing to have. And I think we can think about, if we think about democracy and start to look at, especially working from Huxley's assessment of the situation, we can make an argument. I don't know that we've ever had a state where we were actually living in a democratic way, where social relations were defined in a democratic way, in the way John Dewey would define it, as an associated way of living. I don't think we've ever had that. We have certainly, I don't think we've ever embodied that in terms of being. I think we have, in the past, maybe grasped for it, but certainly now I think that democracy in the West, in North America, the United States in particular, is more of a chimera, more of a representation of democracy, a front, than it is a substance in terms of our lives. In 2013, Noam Chomsky stated that roughly 70% of the population, that is the lower 70% in terms of wealth and income, have virtually no influence whatsoever in terms of public policy. He described, he's talking about the United States, Americans as effectively disenfranchised. As you move up the wealth and income ladder, you get a little bit more influence on policy, and when you get to the top, which is maybe the 10th of 1%, people essentially get what they want. They determine the policy. So the proper term is not democracy, but plutocracy. And he stated that in 2013. And earlier this year, in an article in Perspectives on Politics, which is an American Political Science Association journal, Martin Gellens and Benjamin Page actually put an empirical study to this issue. They were seeking answers to questions like who governs, who really rules, to what extent is a broad body of U.S. citizens sovereign, semi-sovereign, or largely powerless. And what they did in this empirical study was use a unique data set that looked at almost 1,800 different policy issues. And using some fairly sophisticated statistical analyses, what they found was that economic elites and organized groups representing corporate and business interests have substantially taken control of U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent effect. The empirical evidence strongly pointed to, Gillens and Page said, that the theories of economic elite domination and biased pluralism, which is a situation where corporate and business associations and professional groups dominate the political and economic spectrum, actually are more descriptive of the United States than the political idea of a majoritarian electoral democracy. Now, this is not really brand new news, but it's certainly news that has been substantiated empirically in a very dramatic way. And it's not just a right or a left-wing kind of perspective. In fact, someone who, Andrew Bacevich, who's a retired U.S. Army colonel, and he's now a professor of international relations at Boston College, the author of The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, and The New American Militarism, How Americans Are Seduced by War, was described in a Canadian newspaper profile just last week as painting a portrait of the U.S. that is essentially a denunciation. Its politics are corrupt, its military leadership incompetent, its people venal, self-centered, and robotic, caught up in their messianic, almost religious mission to bend the world to their self-image. Americans, Basevich says, have no ability to think independently. And that's quite an indictment. And when I read that, I thought, it's not just an indictment of Americans, it's an indictment of the work we do as social studies educators. So here's my conclusion. I've got a lot more to say, but I'm starting with my conclusion. This is like my dad was a Pentecostal minister, and he always started, he told you what his 3 points were up front, but then he went on for hours after that. I'm not going to go on for hours, though. But this is in a paper that you can find on my academia.edu page, or if you go to ewayneross.net, and I think it got distributed to a few classes. This is the conclusion of that paper, basically, in my talk tonight, that dangerous citizenship, which is what I'm going to be talking about, requires a praxis-inspired mindset of opposition and resistance, and acceptance of strategic and tactical stances. The implication is that dangerous citizenship is dangerous to an oppressive and socially unjust status quo and to existing hierarchical structures of power. The basic idea is that these existing hierarchical structures of power and social injustices that exist as the status quo are parts of what keep our society from becoming democratic. And practicing dangerous citizenship requires people individually and collectively to take actions that bring with them certain risks, actions that transcend traditional maneuvers such as voting and signing petitions. So when I'm talking about, when I talk about dangerous citizenship, or when I think about my own conceptualization of what democracy is, it's not something that we can teach by referring to a golden age, to some kind of shared assumption that's not critically examined. What do we mean when we say democracy? So when I think about this concept of dangerous citizenship, what I'm talking about is a radical critique of schooling as social control. And dangerous citizenship is a collection of strategies that we would use to disrupt and resist the conforming, anti-democratic, anti-collective, and oppressive potentialities of society and schooling. And it's not really a recipe, but it includes three things that I think are really important. One is it demands political participation, and here I say political non-participation or participation, because it's not political participation in a traditional way. It's not about voting. It's not about writing your congressman or congresswoman. It involves, and I'm going to give you some examples in just a minute, political engagement on a different level. It also involves critical consciousness, drawing from Freire, and also class consciousness from Marx. And most importantly, it's about intentional action, behaviors designed to instigate human connection, true engagement with everyday life in meaningful experiences, meaningful communications, and change. At heart, for me, when I think about social studies education, the purposes of social studies education, from my point of view, this is what I tell my students when I have them in social studies ed classes. And this is the way I think about those students when I think about my own pedagogy. How can we get students to develop personally meaningful understandings of the world, and to also understand that they have agency to act on that world and to change it? And that's what I think dangerous citizenship is about. It's about trying to cultivate that. And I think that it is dangerous for citizens these days to have personally meaningful understandings of the world that they act on. Now, when I say a radical critique, I will talk a little bit about that. And Michel Foucault talks about critique this way. It's not a matter of saying things that are not right as they are. It's a matter of pointing out what kinds of assumptions, what kinds of familiar, unchallenged, unconsidered modes of thought and practices that we accept. Criticism is a matter of fleshing out that thought, trying to change it, to show that things are not as self-evident as one believed. To see that what is accepted as self-evident will no longer be accepted as such. Practicing criticism is a matter of making facile gestures difficult. And that's really what I'm trying to point out here about teaching about democracy. I think oftentimes we think teaching about democracy, we treat it as something that's facile, it's something that's we can do very easily. We can call on particular kinds of tropes about being a citizen in a democratic society. And what I'm attempting to do with the construct of dangerous citizenship is to make those facile moves much more difficult. Do we want to teach for capitalist democracy? Indeed, given what we know about the lack of democracy in the United States and the world, is it even possible to teach for a democracy that is not dominated by capital? Is the concept of democracy bankrupt? Is it even salvageable? And if it is salvageable, then it seems to me that teaching about and for democracy in contemporary times cannot be done without engaging in the complexities and contradictions that have come to define what really existing or non-existing democracy is. It's a practice that must be understood as difficult, risky, and even dangerous. How do we break free of the tropes that have come to dominate our conceptions of democracy and define what it means to be a democratic citizen? Well, I've got 3 or 4 premises that I want to throw out to you as ways in which we can start to actually do that. Premise number 1 is that capitalism is not compatible with democracy. That is, that there's a contradiction between the ideals of democracy and what capitalist democracy actually delivers. For example, what Chomsky calls spectator democracy, and something that I've developed in other places that I've written. Basically, democracy that allows you only to participate in a very superficial level. We're giving 2 choices. We can vote for the Democrat or the Republican. Or and I'm not a Canadian citizen, I live in Canada, but in Canada they get even more choices than that. You can vote Conservative, you can vote Liberal, you can vote Green, you can vote New Democratic. And in BC, in provincial elections, you can vote for the Work Less Party and the BC Marijuana Party. And once I become a citizen, and we have the conflation of capitalism with democracy. And I want to kind of quickly run through what I'm talking about here in terms of these contradictions. So if we look at capitalism and democracy, trying to look at what's going on in terms of what we experience as democracy, we basically have a corporate state. We have attacks on civil liberties and the free press. We have a rise of racism and a resegregation of schools. We have the promotion of the fear of sexuality. Government and corporate attacks on the wages of workers. This is in the paper that I have that goes with this talk. I spent a fair amount of time talking about the dispute between the teachers in British Columbia and the government, which is systematically attacked using human capital policies, the wages and the working conditions of teachers in British Columbia. We have the intensification of imperialist wars, the promotion of nationalism, that is the unity of all classes, when in fact we're not all in this together, which is my next point. Increased mysticism and incessant attacks on radicals, people who have points of view that exist outside what is considered the acceptable discourse. And in a capitalist state, the function of democracy really looks like this. We have the state guaranteeing the accumulation of capital, the preservation and tempering of class rule, raising money to fund the state, regulating labor, facilitating commerce, ensuring buying power, subsidizing private corporations, the sanctioning of corporate self-regulation, and the advance of global capitalist interest of global capitalism, which to me doesn't really look like the democracy that I think about when I think about democracy. So essentially, and these are premises, and of course we're going to have some time to talk about this, and you can argue with me about it, but I would say that democracy doesn't dominate capital. In fact, what happens is democracy submits to capital. Probably the best example of that is how the current Supreme Court has made, free speech concomitant with how much money you have in terms of political advertising in elections. Democracy submits to capital, and capitalist democracy atomizes citizens to the point where we are merely individuals asking this favorite question of capitalism, which is, what about me? Premise 2 is that teachers and curriculum have been subjected to ever-intensifying policy regimes that attack academic freedom and discourage critical social analysis. So we have neoliberal education reform, and the acronym that I think I got it from Pasi Sahlberg, the Finnish educator, GERM, Global Education Reform Movement. Because what I'm talking about is not just developments and themes in the US and Canada, but something that's global. That is the marketization and the privatization of education, human capital policies for teachers that restrict academic freedom, that attack teachers' abilities to work collectively. And one of the big issues in British Columbia during the last a teacher strike that just ended in September was trying to get more prep time for teachers. Regulation of what people know and how they come to know it, which really, and I'm not going to talk specifically about curriculum standards and high stakes testing, but that's the reference there. So what we've got in the United States with this regulation of what we can know and when we can know it is basically a bipartisan attack on teachers' autonomy and decision-making in schools. And it's a Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama education agenda that involves the regulation of curriculum, racist and working class, anti-working class, high-stakes examinations, and the deepening militarization of schools. The primary role of capitalist schools is social control, winning the children of the poor and the working classes over to be obedient, dutiful, useful to the ruling classes under a variety of lies, like we're all in this together, that this is a multicultural society, that democracy trumps equality, and we can all be president or, in Canada, prime minister. To set up a little bit of a contrast to this, if I can find in my notes, catch up to my PowerPoint, Paulo Freire says that citizenship implies freedom. And this is it's not too long of a quote, I'll read it for you. It says, yes, citizenship. This is from Teachers as Cultural Workers in 1998. Yes, citizenship, above all in a society like ours, of such authoritarian, racially, sexually, and class-based discriminatory traditions, is really an invention. Citizenship is an invention, a political production. In a sense, one who suffers any or all of the discriminations does not enjoy the full exercise of citizenship as a peaceful and recognized right. On the contrary, it is a right to be reached and whose conquest makes democracy grow substantively. Citizenship implies freedom. Citizenship is not obtained by chance. It is a construction never finished, demands that we fight for it. It demands a commitment, political clarity, coherence, and decision. For this reason, a democratic education cannot be realized apart from an education of and for citizenship or freedom. Now, when we think about social control and citizenship education, and when I say that the goal of capitalist schools is social control, that doesn't really distinguish capitalist schools from any other kind of schools. Really. In fact, in John Dewey in 1916, in Democracy of Education, he and education, he talks about all societies use education as a means of social control, even democratic ones. And then he goes on to make a case in Democracy and Education for why we need democratic education. That means that this notion of social control and the role of schools is not something that we can just accept as coming to us fully formed. It's like Freire talking about citizenship. It's not something that we just have, but it's something that we have to construct. And I think a good reference on this is the work of Paul Taylor, who in a book from way back, 1961, called Normative Discourse, says we must decide what ought to be the case. We cannot discover what ought to be the case by investigating what is the case. And I want you to think about that for a second. What Taylor is saying is that through social science, through scientific investigation, we cannot decide what ought to be done. There is not an objective, value-free answer to those questions. They are social constructions. So when Dewey is talking about democratic education in his book written in 1916, he's making a normative argument for a particular role of schools. And I think that's important for us to think about. And if we understand that democracy is a concept that's under construction, that it's a normative concept, we can better understand how democracy gets so perverted that we have Aldous Huxley in writing Brave New World and describing what happens to democracy under the name of democracy there. Or we can think about what's happened to democracy in the United States in our post-9/11 world, where we have the reduction of civil rights and various other kinds of anti-democratic policies that become defining of our life in a democratic society. Now, we do have some callbacks that we can look for in social studies. And I'm not saying that these are the answers, but we have people that have been struggling with this question for a long time, going back to the 1930s, social reconstructionists, who argued that teachers should work towards social change by implementing democratic principles, collective responsibilities, and economic justice. So people like George S. Counts, who wrote Dare the School Build a New Social Order, or Harold Rugg, who actually had quite a successful textbook series that brought critical questioning about American life and democracy to hundreds of thousands of students. So we have some models that we can look at and we can call on. Now, in the paper that I've referred to a couple of times, we can look at how social control and citizenship education get played out. And you probably, some of you at least, are probably a little familiar with some of these issues. In Arizona, a few years ago, we had the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, which was declared illegal by the state government because students were reading histories of Chicano, histories of the United States written from a Chicano perspective, et cetera, et cetera. And I kind of are you guys familiar with that situation? Yeah, I figured you would be. Or the 2010 revision of the Texas social studies curriculum, which stresses the superiority of capitalism, questioning a secular state, representing conservative philosophies in a more positive light, the removal of Harriet Tubman, the inclusion of St. Thomas Aquinas, nothing against Aquinas, but, and you have, as recently the Jefferson County, this is Denver, Colorado School Board, who's attacked the AP history curriculum as being anti-American. So we have these normative discourses of what is appropriate and what ought to be that are embedded in, the work of the state, the work of school boards, the work of teachers. And I think we need to think about that this is there is a discourse that we can engage with and we can have an impact on it. We don't have to accept the same tropes, the same kind of frameworks that are handed down to us from curriculum, from textbooks or state government curricula, et cetera, is something that we need to engage with. Or in a case that I spent quite a bit of time in the paper talking about, in Prince Rupert schools in British Columbia. And Prince Rupert is way up north. It's like up towards Alaska, the panhandle of Alaska, where the school board attacked the notion of political messages being delivered in schools. And the situation here, and I would agree that we shouldn't have partisan politics in schools to the level of, where teachers are wearing billboards for, one party or the other. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have political discourse in schools. There's a difference there. And this is what teachers in Prince Rupert were sanctioned for wearing. They wore t-shirts that said on the front, "To be or not to be." And they're in reference to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And you can read Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms on the back of this t-shirt. It's the guarantee that everyone has the following fundamental freedoms: the freedom of conscience and religion, the freedom of thought, belief, and opinion, expression, including freedom of the press and other media communication, the freedom of peaceful assembly, and the freedom of association. But this was a political message that was decided by the school board and upheld by an administrative judge as being too political for schools. This is just a little callback to the Jefferson County. You guys familiar with what the teachers called in? There was a sick out for a couple of days. Students protested. This is what the school board in Jefferson County set down. It has subsequently been recalled and revised a bit. But the review criteria for AP, this is for social studies, AP history, was kind of the lightning rod here, shall include the following. Instructional materials should present the most current factual information accurately and objectively. Theories should be distinguished from fact. Materials should promote citizenship, patriotism, essentials and benefits of the free enterprise system, respect for authority, respect for individual rights. Materials should not encourage or condone civil disorder, social strife, and the disregard of law, et cetera, et cetera. I taught ninth grade. When I taught in Fulton County schools, social studies in Georgia was known as social science education. And I taught 8th grade anthropology. I taught 9th grade economics. I taught 12th grade sociology. And the book that they gave me to teach 9th grade economics was called The Free Enterprise System in America. I didn't use that book. What I did, and I was talking with Todd about this last night, I was pretty good at going back into the book room and finding all the discarded materials from the earlier days. And I found a book that did case studies of comparative economics across time and across cultures. I also unearthed some old Manna course of study materials to use in my anthropology class and the high school geography project to use in my geography classes. Most of you don't know what I'm talking about, but I know a few of you do. Premise 3. Civil disobedience this is Howard Zinn. Civil disobedience is not our problem. This is kind of a response back to the Jefferson County School Board. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is that people all over the world have obeyed the dictates of leaders, and millions have been killed because of this obedience. Our problem is that people are obedient all over the world in the face of poverty, starvation, stupidity, war, and cruelty. Our problem is that people are obedient while the jails are full of petty thieves and the grand thieves are running the country. That's our problem. Premise 4. We need new pedagogical imaginaries for teaching because traditional conceptions of democratic citizenship are bankrupt, perverted by capitalism's triumph over the interests of the public. And what I've tried to do is collect what I call pedagogical imaginaries, places that we can go and look for ideas that might inspire us to think about what democracy means, what it could mean, and how we might teach about it. And one of the places that I found quite productive and interesting for myself could be described as post-left, insurrectionist, anarchism, and politically inspired performance artists who creatively disrupt everyday life and offer models for creative pedagogies of resistance. So I don't have a plan. There's no plan. What I really want people to do is to stop accepting the idea that we know what democracy is and we kind of know what teaching for democracy is. And let's start to creatively disrupt our own thinking, and where possible, managing risk. Let's start to let those pedagogical imaginaries be drawn on to recreate our pursuit of democratic education in a democratic society. Now I'm going to show you really quickly, because I'm definitely going to stop at 7. I'm going to show you a few things. I might not get all the way through my clips here, but I'm going to talk about this because I was talking about this afternoon. We could look at Desserteau. I like French theorists. You guys like French theorists? I love French theorists, but I don't really buy into all they say. I'm pretty heterodox. I just kind of pick and choose the stuff I like. So don't be threatened by those guys. They're mainly guys. So go read you some Guattari or Debord or Desserteau. But anyway, Desserteau's idea of, and I failed French, I'll say this, at the University of North Carolina. I'm going to try to say this right, but it's la perruque. And it means the wig. And this is the idea, is that it's a diversionary practice of workers using the employer's resources for their own personal use. And what Desserteau talks about, this was written back in the 1984, he talks, and one of his examples is like a secretary writing a love letter on company time, using the company's typewriter and stationery and stuff, right? Okay, well, I like that idea. Workers' own work disguised as the work of the employer. This is, some of you might remember a little book called Teaching as a Subversive Activity. This is the idea. How do we're charged as basically as agents of the state to deliver this curriculum, this social studies curriculum. But what can we do in our classrooms where we kind of disguise our work for the employer and actually pursue our own projects? And I'm not talking about stealing stuff, but maybe pilfering and you've all taken home a ream of paper from school, I know you have. The worker who indulges in la perruque diverts time from the factory work for what's free, creative, and precisely not directed for profit. And I think there's a way we can read that claim up against standardized curriculum and high-stakes testing that are used to enforce the standardized curriculum. How can we be free and creative and precise and teach precisely in ways that are not directed towards the standards that are demanded, especially when we disagree with the standards or we think there's another way to think about it? That's la perruque, the wig. And I want to show you just a really brief clip from Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which I think demonstrates this idea. It's only a couple of minutes.
Now, in 1898, Spain owned Cuba outright. Think about it. Cuba owned by a disorganized parliament over 4,000 miles away. Cubans were in a constant state of revolt. In 1904, the United States decided to throw a little weight around and, Who is it?
Mr. Pizza Guy.
Again?
Mr. Pizza Guy, sir. Who ordered the double cheese and sausage?
Right here, dude. Hey, dude. Am I hallucinating here? Just what in the hell do you think you're doing?
Learned about Cuba, having some food.
Mr. Spicoli, you're on dangerous ground here. You're causing a major disturbance on my time.
I've been thinking about this, Mr. Hand. If I'm here and you're here, doesn't that make it our time?
That's the point. That's la perruque. If I'm here and you're here, doesn't it make it our time? That's one of the ways that we can think about our own classrooms. That if we're there and our students are there, then it's our time. And then how do we make pedagogical decisions in this context that allow us to learn about Cuba and have some food? or whatever it is we're trying to do, because there's nothing wrong with having some food and learning about Cuba. So that's La Perouse. Does anybody know the Yes Men? Have you ever heard of the Yes Men? I encourage you to go to yeslab.org. And basically what the Yes Men do is they impersonate corporate criminals to publicly humiliate them and to give journalists excuses to cover important issues. And this is one of the Yes Men. And here he is on BBC World Live. And on the anniversary of the Union Carbide Bhopal disaster, if you remember that, where Union Carbide released poisonous gas that killed thousands of people in Bhopal, India. He went on BBC World posing as a Dow chemical executive. Dow bought Union Carbide for something like, I don't know, $12 billion. And he said that they were going to use $12 billion to rectify the mistakes that they made in Bhopal. Now that's pretty crafty to be able to do that. But I think there are ways that we can kind of manage risk and think about, well, what's the pedagogical implication here? What's the pedagogical principle here? Go check out the Yes Men. This one, I think, maybe be a little, do you guys know what Burning Man is? You've heard of Burning Man? Todd has, he's probably been. Burning Man, Hakim Bey talks about, and Burning Man's an example of what Hakim Bey talks about when he talks about temporary autonomous zones. This is like an alternative model of revolution. And this is what I really like about this. A lot of people, when they think about revolutions, they're put off and they say, oh, well, a revolution is too much work. And how are we ever going to get everybody together anyway? And we're just going to have to wait and wait and wait for the right moment. And what Bey says is, no, we just create in the here and now, not waiting for some revolutionary moment, we create it now. It might be an ephemeral, a short passing time, but it's a place where we are right now, where we have some autonomy. And we do it in a way that avoids the direct confrontation with the state, which is kind of the underlying assumption about what any revolution is, any kind of political revolution. So what could we do if we started to think about our own social studies classrooms as temporary autonomous zones? I like the idea. This is another example of creative disruption of everyday life. This is from a international feminist group called Sub Rosa. And what they did, and I encourage you to check this out too, and go and look at the report that they did on human trafficking. And basically, this is a survey that they used, that they distributed to people, and it's about filling out a survey to find out how much your flesh is worth. And it looks at human trafficking of women, not just as, not just for the sex industry or into slavery, but also for selling body parts. And Sub Rosa's analysis of this issue is, I think, really quite amazing. But to use a very, I guess I wanted to show you this because it uses a very benign, familiar kind of idea, just like a questionnaire that in and of itself raises profound issues. Or the surveillance camera players. You guys have surveillance cameras on campus here? I bet you do. There's probably one in here. I know that there's a camera there. The surveillance camera players play to the surveillance cameras. I said I was going to quit at 7. It's almost 7. There's just two things I want to, and I'm not going to show you this clip, but I like this idea from Guy Debord, who I mentioned earlier, called derive, which is literally drifting. And he argues that, he describes it as kind of an experimental behavior where you drop your usual motives for your movements in a space. And Debord was talking about living in an urban space. And I think in the context of thinking about the school and how schools regulate our movements as teachers and students, there's a control regime in everyday life in schools. And I'm not even talking metaphorically. I'm talking about when the day starts, when the day ends, at the end of a period, when it's time, when it's your time, and when it's the school's time. That derive is an interesting concept to think about. And it's also interesting to think about in terms of the enforcement of standardized curricula. What does it mean to think about dropping our usual motives for coverage of curriculum and drifting through a curriculum, finding the things that we're attracted to, and allowing that attraction to draw us in and to bring us to the activities that we engage in? What can we find there when we reject the standardized control? And it's kind of a trippy little thing, but DeBoard talked about going to London and trying to navigate, really geographically navigate the streets of London with a map of Paris. I think he might have been voting for the BC Marijuana Party, but and they turn him all, which is another of DeBoard's ideas, and this is the last point I'm going to make, which involves capturing various kind of what he described as spectacular images and turning them around in a new presentation to subvert the authority of the sign and the significations it sets in order. So in other words, what you do is you take a media work that's meant to communicate one thing and you use it against itself. Has anybody ever seen or read the magazine Adbusters? You've seen that? That's produced in Vancouver. And they produce something that they call subvertisements. So they take like corporate ads and they turn them against themselves. I'm going to show you some examples of détournement. These are not examples that I'm saying to be used in social studies classes, but for us to think about, well, actually the first example I'm going to show you is the primo example of détournement in social studies. If I can get my slide to go forward. Please go forward. No, that's not it. This is it. It's John Stewart's textbook, America, with a foreword by Thomas Jefferson. That's an example of détournement. If you guys seen this? I know it's a little old for some of you now. Perry Marker wrote a great review of this book in Theory and Research in Social Education a few years ago. This is détournement, as is this. And this. And this. And this. And since Vancouver and Atlanta shared the Olympics, these are little détournements of the creatures on the right there were our Vancouver mascot thingies. I can't remember their names. Can you remember the Atlanta mascot names? Izzy. Oh, that's good. Because now I remember that. This is a détournement of CNN that was done by a guy named Frank Discussion. Who's a punk rocker. Here's another one. I kind of like that one. And this is one that Frank Discussion did, which is a letter from the Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction that was sent out to students. It's not really a letter from the Superintendent of Public Instruction, but I know it's difficult to read this, but it's called Bored with School, and it's a letter from the Superintendent of Public Instruction to the students of Arizona talking about how boring school is and setting up a contest for students to write essays to send to the Arizona Board of Education about why they are the best, the primo example of a good student. And they offer a cash prize, and at the very end it says, we offer you a cash prize because that's all we have to offer you. Now, this is the very last thing. Then I'm going to shut up. Hopefully you'll have something to say. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It's based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. And if we do act in however small a way. We don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now, to live as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that's bad around us, is itself a remarkable victory. And in this way, I think what Howard Zinn is actually calling out is something very similar to the temporary autonomous zone. That we don't have to have a full plan. We don't even really have to, and I haven't even talked about acting strategically. I've only given you examples of tactics, because I don't really want to give you a strategy. I think you should come up with your own strategy. You should come up with what it is you're trying to achieve in your role as a social studies educator. But I think one of the ways that we can start to reimagine what the point of our endeavors are is to start to look for tactics that we can use that are kind of outside the box, that reject the old tropes and allow us to creatively disrupt our own thinking about what it means to be a social studies educator in the pursuit of a really existing democracy that's one about people living in association with one another. People who are able to communicate with one another. Not that it's going to resolve disagreements, but we're able to have conversations about them, and we're able to move forward in ways that are productive for the greater good and not just the good of the elite dominant class who happens to be setting the agenda for everybody right now. So that's all I have to say, and I hope we can have some good discussion here over the last 25 minutes. Thank you very much. Yes. Well, you could use that. I'm just thinking, I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think there was a golden era where everything was, where we were actually embodying that as a nation. But I think, I guess I probably did overstate that. I mean, there are models out there. We could look at the Paris Commune, for example, would be another one to look at. That's true. Yes. Yes.
So as someone's going to be entering the field next year, hopefully, and someone who buys into wants to promote some type of transformative democratic education, I know you mentioned sort of like the risks that are dangerous inherent with this, I guess you would say neo-Marxist, like critical look at capitalism, like the harmful ways of making it reproducible.
Mm-hmm.
I guess how legitimate do you think those dangers are?
They're very real. I knew you were going to ask that question. I'm totally prepared to answer it because I've been asked it a million times. Yeah. That's a great question, and it goes back. And I'm going to call out my. Todd mentioned my dissertation, and that's the first time it's been mentioned in a long time. But in my dissertation, I looked at the socialization of secondary social studies teachers. And one of the things that came out of that I think, and it really wasn't my own idea, but if you look at the the literature on professional socialization, you can kind of come to this conclusion that there are basically three pathways that you're going to face as a new teacher going into to work in the schools. And you want legitimacy, you want to be accepted, you want to